guys. Thank you for joining us today on our MHU lunch chat. We're trying to do this about once a week. Next week, we'll actually be changing the time and day to Wednesday at noon. And I'll actually be talking about conditioning your horse for spring and summer activities. Hopefully we still have some activities to look forward to when all of this is said and done. Today, though, I want to introduce Tom Guthrie. He's a colleague of mine and also a good friend, and he's in the Jackson area of Michigan. Tom is our state equine educator, so he makes his way around the entire state throughout the year, working with horse owners like yourself, helping with a variety of issues, including pasture management, but also he does a lot of facility analysis, and as well as manure management type issues. So we're really excited to listen to what Tom has to say about getting our pastures ready for this spring and summer. I know some of you guys that are going to be joining us from the south probably already have some good grazing going on, but here in Michigan, we're pretty far behind that 8 ball. And so we're really looking forward to our pastures here in a few weeks coming up. And especially right now, I know I have a lot of stakeholders that are concerned from a budget standpoint on keeping our horses, caring for our horses on a budget right now. And so pastures are going to be a really great resource for us to make that happen over the spring and summer. So Tom, with that, I will give it over to you. And just one other reminder, as we're going through Tom's going through his presentation, if you have any questions or comments, just put them in the chat and I'll raise that to Tom's attention. And for those of you joining us on Facebook Live, I'll be monitoring the Facebook comments as well. Okay, Tom.
All right, Chris, thanks. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to get the chance to visit with everyone over the lunch hour here. And we'll talk a little bit about horse pasture management, evaluate and make the most of your resources. I have my contact information here too, if anybody wants it, phone number and email. All right, so when we talk about pasture, right, there's lots of things that kind of go into this whole thing. And this can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. So we've got grazing, we've got partial season grazing, we've got stocking density, Timothy. You know, it's a cool season grass. You need a tractor, turnout time, mower. I mean, the list just keeps going on. And before we know it, we've got something that looks like this, right? And it can be overwhelming at times. So I'm going to attempt to kind of break this into some sections here. And once I get through all of these, okay, and try to outline a couple different things that are really important for managing your horse pastures. So the objective here is to consider and evaluate the possibility of implementing a pasture management plan with a grazing system that works best for your respective farm, okay? Because not all farms are the same. And to understand the key components of pasture management that allows for an informed decision to be reached. Okay, so that's where we'll go. The second objective there, that's when we're going to our key points. Okay, so when we look at goals and considerations, so trying to figure out what the goals of the farm are. Okay, I've got on here pasture versus, and I like to refer to it as a turnout with the opportunity to graze. Okay, when I think of pasture, I think that horses are out there 100% of the time, That's their nutrition source. We're not bringing them in to feed them hay. Okay, the horses are actually living on the pasture. Versus a turnout with opportunity to graze, where horses might be turned out for periods of the time, or they're turned out and there's some forage available out there. However, we're bringing them in to feed them hay in the morning, potentially in the morning or in the evening. Okay, and so the other thing when you're looking at goals of your farm, is it realistic? Okay, can it be accomplished? And then we're talking about management practices. We need to look ahead. We need to look way ahead, right? So if our pasture is struggling, it's just not going to happen over a month period of time, right? If we're looking at reseeding or tilling up our pasture to reseed it, we need to be looking a couple months ahead of time of doing that. So we look at land-based resources. I've got this on here, and I term it as usable acres. Okay, here, at least in Michigan, we have a lot of wetlands and we have a lot of wooded area. Okay, so let's say that an individual may own 15 acres, for example. Okay, and 5 of that might be woods, and you might have another 2 that might actually be wetland that's not usable for the management of your horses, right? So now that's 7 acres out of the way. If we have an outdoor riding arena, we have a barn, we have a house, let's say that takes up a couple more acres, so 2 more acres, right? So now out of our 15, we've got a total of, 9 that's not usable. So now we're down to 6 usable acres that we could potentially manage our horses on, okay? And then number of horses as far as stocking density goes, right? Typically, a very general guideline for stocking density for horses is about 2 acres per horse. Okay, if you're on sandy soil, that might increase a little bit more. Okay. All right, so let's get into the 5 important tools for success. And I've just made a short list here. Sacrifice dry lot area, soil testing, grazing stick, and I just like to term it manage the grass. We also need a tractor with a mower and fencing. So let's jump into these real quick here. We've got a sacrifice dry lot area. Okay, as you can see in the picture down on the bottom right. Okay, this is a sacrifice or a dry lot area. See, we have really good fencing around this. There's no vegetation growing in this area. And if you can just visualize, to the right of this picture is where the barn is. Okay, it's an old hip roof barn where the horses have the opportunity to go underneath the barn for shelter. There's an area there for shelter for the horses in the basement area. And this dry lot actually slopes downward out towards the soybean field and the pasture with the tree in it. That's where all the water runs off to. So we need to make sure that we have ample room to feed hay, the horses have shelter, and we have the appropriate fencing for a dry lot area. Okay, site location. What is the location to the other buildings? Obviously, right? We need to have accessibility to the pastures. We need to avoid those wetland areas, especially here in Michigan. Like I mentioned, that we have a lot of those, even though it's waste ground essentially for managing our horses. We want to keep our horses out of those areas. Avoid an area in close proximity to wells. Okay, we need to make sure that we're staying our dry lot area where there could potentially be any type of manure accumulation or runoff of nutrients from manure. We need to keep a good distance away from our wellheads, at least 100 feet, if not more. And then I've got locate your dry lot area in a south or east facing area. This will just allow for quicker dry out time. When we think about it, the sun rises in the east, right? And about noon or so, it's going to be overhead. Just gives us more chance to get sunlight to that area, hopefully help it dry it out. Size. We want to try to keep our dry lot areas to a minimum size, but size may vary dependent on use. Okay, a lot of times you'd like to see getting down to that 400 to 500 square feet per horse. Okay, but if we look at the Midwest Plan Service Horse Facilities Handbook, if the horses are going to be spending quite a bit of time in that respective area, then we need about 1,000 square feet per horse to allow them ample exercise. As far as maintenance is concerned, provisions to collect manure accumulations, parasite and odor control, these are all some considerations that we need to be thinking about with our sacrificed dry lot area. Stormwater collection from buildings, and then also a vegetative filter strip or a thick stand of grass surrounding that respective dry lot so we can catch any runoff that may happen. Okay, so with the sacrifice or dry lot area, no vegetative cover at all. The goal is to not have any vegetative cover in this area. Okay, and a lot of times you might need some improved foundation in the high traffic areas. Okay, so you get good drainage from that area. So the sacrifice dry lot area is going to be really handy to keep horses in and when the pasture is not ready to be grazed. Okay, so it's a really good management tool. Next thing is soil fertility and pasture productivity. So if you haven't had your soil analyzed lately, I would recommend that you do that. It just gives you an indication of what your soil, what nutrients your soil may need. Okay, I get lots of questions on when I go to horse farms is what type of fertilizer do you think it needs, or how much do you think it needs? And my question always is, have you had your soil analyzed? Okay, we can stand around and guess what it might need till next year. But if you get a soil analysis done, it's going to help you determine where you're at with your soil health and what nutrients are there. The soil tests last, or they're good for, I guess you could say, they're good for a 3-year period. Okay, and places that may assist with that would be your local extension office. You could work with your grain elevators, potentially seed dealers. They all can help you do that. As it stands right now in Michigan, I know our lab at Michigan State University is accepting soil samples. They're allowing you to mail them in, and they are processing them. And so I'll have some information later on where you can go and find that information if you're interested in that. Okay. So tools, soil test, soil probe or a shovel. You need a clean plastic bucket, 15 to 20 random samples per field. Okay. And so you want to take a slice of soil approximately 5 to 10 inches deep. We just don't want to skim the surface. You mix all those samples together, and then after you do that, after you mix them all together, you're typically going to utilize 4 cups of dry soil. And as you can see here down on the right-hand side, this is a pasture area on a farm. We would just kind of want to make that zigzag pattern going across the field, taking soil samples to ensure that we're getting a representative sample of what's across the whole pasture. Okay, we don't want to just go out and take one soil sample right in the middle of the pasture and say, okay, good enough, because that's going to tell us what's available or what's there in that respective spot. Okay, you may be wondering about cost. Soil analysis to get one sample analyzed, it's relatively inexpensive. It's about $12 a sample. It could be a little bit more, 12 to 15. But it's relatively inexpensive to do, and it will tell you a lot as far as getting your pasture set and ready to go, so you can grow some quality forage. Okay, fertilization. Like I mentioned before, you just need to rely on your soil test to monitor the requirements. Okay, Grazing restrictions after fertilizing are pretty minimal. Fertilizers are minerals, remember, they're not pesticides. So if you're using a liquid application, remove horses until fertilizer has dried. If you're using a powder formulation, horses can graze the next day or after a rainfall. I typically recommend that you just wait to turn the horses out onto the pasture until after you get a good soaking rain. Okay, on to managing the forage. Okay, so one thing that you can do if you're looking or trying to determine what pasture quality is you can take a visual assessment. And so you've got these categories here. So your dry lot area, obviously that's the area to exercise, but it needs to be free of any vegetative matter, is like I mentioned before. If you're looking at your pasture and you see a lot of weeds that account for the majority of the vegetative matter, then you might rate your pasture quality as poor. Fair might be interspersed with some weeds. If it's moderate, okay, so you might have a mix of grass and or legumes interspersed with weeds. And then your best visual assessment could be a thick stand of grass and or a legume species. So if you're going out just to get a visual assessment of it, try to rank it in one of these categories, and then you can kind of go from there to see where you're at. Okay, so when we're looking at categories, okay, we've got legumes. Those are alfalfas, your clovers, okay? Those are plants that are notable for their ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen, and they can provide nitrogen to companion grasses, okay? Up here in Michigan, we deal a lot with cool season grasses. Those grow best in the spring and fall, okay, when the soil and air temperatures are cooler. And then you've got some warm season grasses, such as teff, okay? Those plants grow more vigorously through June, from June through early September, okay? Your warm season grasses are well adapted to hot and dry weather, and it will stay green in July and August. Teff is a warm season grass in the state here that's gained a little bit of popularity with horse owners, but it's really hard to get established. It's an annual, and it's really hard to get established because the seed is so small, and your seed bed needs to be very firm, firm as where you can bounce a basketball off of it. Okay, but typically up here in our state, we're dealing with the cool season grasses. Okay, so if you're wondering or wanting more information about horse pastures and seed mixtures and all of that sort of thing, okay, our forage extension specialist, Dr. Kim Cassada, manages the website, the Forage Connection website at Michigan State University. And this is the web address for it. And if you go on that website, it has forages for horses, and it has several bulletins underneath that. If you're looking to establish a pasture for forage establishment, it has several bulletins under that. Okay, those are all, you can click on them, you can read them, download them. Okay, you can also find information for the MSU soil lab under soil nutrient management and health. They even have a document on there that teaches you how to read your soil test. There's grazing management. And then another link on here that some may be interested in is the Michigan Hay Sellers list. And that is essentially a website where you can go on, you can select a specific area that you're looking at to buy hay. And it will show you what some hay producers may have available for sale in that respective area, how much they have, so on and so forth. So this is an excellent resource if you're looking for that sort of information. Okay, so moving on to grazing strategy. Okay. We can have continuous grazing where your horses have access to that single pasture nearly all the time. Okay, partial season, Horses are restricted to grazing pasture only part of the year. I mentioned up here that we have a lot of wetlands in Michigan, and there might be certain areas of or times of the year where a certain piece of the pasture may be flooded, but then throughout the summertime, it may not. Okay, it's not specifically a wetland, but it's gathering lots of water in that respective area. So that might be a time where we're gonna put the horses out there when there's not water and let them graze the grass that's there. Okay, turnout with opportunity to graze. That's when multiple horses have daily access to a pasture for shorter periods. So that might be, you know, if you're training horses, you're bringing them in and out of the barn, okay, and you're just turning them out for a short period of time and letting them graze a little bit. There might be an opportunity for them to consume some vegetation. Okay, and then rotational grazing, a pasture that is divided into smaller cells or paddocks and rotating the use of each cell or paddock. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit more. So here we have a pasture plan. It's just a farm example, right? We've got an established pasture, 12 acres, 4 horses. Okay, so this particular farm is has relatively sandy soil, so the horses are stocked at there's 3 acres per horse. Okay, if we're looking at this, I mentioned the sacrifice area. That would be a key to managing your pasture, keeping the horses off when the pasture or the grasses aren't ready to be grazed. Okay, this is our sacrifice lot. It's a little bit bigger. It's not to scale, obviously, but I just wanted to make it big enough so you could understand that, you know, we do have a sacrifice area here to keep horses off the pasture. We need driveway for accessibility to that area, for feeding hay, for manure management, handling horses. You know, we can bring them in, handle them there. You know, if we're bringing them up, catch them for the farrier or the vet or whatever. Okay, so that's one area, and actually from this view, you can actually see the horses out in the pasture. Okay, so continuous, they're out there all the time. And you can look and see here that we do have some bare spots in the pasture where the horses are going back to that same spot and grazing over and over again. Okay, rotational grazing. Okay, how many paddocks would you need? Typically, you want paddocks to supply 7 days of grazing. Okay, in general, for every 7 days of grazing, a pasture will need approximately 21 days of rest. So if you wanted to attempt to implement a rotational grazing system, you would need a minimum of 2 paddocks where you could move them back and forth. Ideally, you could do 4, more if desired. So we're looking at that same farm here. And if you brought this in, you've got your sacrifice area over to the left. The TO that I put in there is essentially designated a turnout area. Okay, it's a smaller area, but I'm not going to be as concerned of maintaining a true pasture in that area. It just might be more of an opportunity to be able to get horses out. When we're looking at that, and Chris, you might want to jump in here on this, but with spring pastures and our horses, you know, there's some time frames that we need to look at and adjusting those. Do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. As far as introducing our horses to spring pasture, it's not so much the area maybe, but the time frame that we put them out on pasture. So I always tell people to, especially if your horse hasn't had any access to grazing over the winter time and they're coming on strong right onto a pasture from the barn, make sure that you introduce pastures for about 15-minute increments, and then each day increase that increment over a 2 to 3 week period. If you have horses that are prone to any metabolic disorders, then it's probably best to wait until that early first rush of spring growth is over with. And then again, just be very cautious as you turn your horses out in that pasture.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the input. Dr. Skelly is our equine extension specialist, who is also a nutritionist. So I appreciate her thoughts. Okay, so when you're looking at a rotational grazing system, you have paddock number 1 here, and you can see where the horses are, right? We might graze that down to 3 to 4 inches. We take the horses off. Okay, the general idea is then, okay, we're going to move them on to paddock number 2, so on and so forth, all the way down to paddock number 4, okay, as we go, right? And so by the time that we get back to paddock 1, you know, if we have 4, then we've got approximately 21 days of rest for that pasture where the grass can regrow, all right? So when we're looking at forage resting guidelines, factors, it's weather and seasonal variation, right? Excuse me. We need to monitor the grazing progress and manage the grass, okay? We really want to try to avoid using a strict calendar of entrance dates and exit dates, right? Because that is really going to be dependent on the weather. But if you're looking for some general timelines, cool season grasses, typically 14 to 16 days during the early spring, okay? Those cool season grasses are really going to be growing early spring. And then we get into late spring, it might be 20 to 30 days. And then during the summer, it's going to be a longer period of time. So those are just very general guidelines, okay? But manage the grass. And so as you can see right here, I like to use, this is a forage stick, but essentially you could use a yardstick. You could use your phone. If you measure your phone, you've always got your phone on you. And stick it down the grass. And I like to call it stop and go grazing right here. So as a general rule, right, when we're looking at our forage is 5 to 10 inches tall, then we want to be grazing, okay? We want to stop grazing when the average height is 3 to 4, okay? But this may vary. And I've got type of pasture plants here too. And so we'll talk, just for one example, as you see right here, we've got Kentucky Bluegrass. Okay, that's a turf grass. It's used to high traffic areas. You can graze that down to 1 to 2 inches, where, like, say, smooth brome grass, okay, we want to stop grazing that at 3 to 4 inches. Okay, it's just the differences in the grasses. Okay, here's another one that I see this quite often, is we really need to utilize that sacrifice or dry lot area to keep horses off the pasture if they're newly seeded, if we have wet conditions, or in a drought. And so last year I was out and about, and here's some hoof tread damage from one specific pasture. And as you can see, the horse took off running and was jumping around and bucking and kicking, okay, and made some skid marks essentially in the pasture. They were all over the place. And this one here that I've measured is about 1 foot long, and it's about 6 inches deep, okay? So we need to make sure that we're taking that into account when we're first turning those horses out, or if it's really wet, we need to keep them off. Excuse me.
Hey, Tom?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions here before we move forward. First of all, if your grass is growing really quickly,
Yep.
would you mow that grass?
You can, if you don't think if you don't think the horses are gonna consume it all. Yep.
Yeah.
That would be one way, and that's another thing that we're going to talk about here coming up in a slide or two with the weeds and toxic plants. But yeah, if you can mow that off, and especially if there are any weeds in there, you want to mow that before those weeds go to seed, and keep that grass competitively growing to essentially outcompete the weeds. So yeah, you can knock the top off.
And I would add to that. I know some people, I've seen pastures out there, and my folks used to do it back home, where they would mow the pastures to look like a golf course. And so horse pastures don't need to be mowed that short. So
No,
you want to make sure, yeah.
I always try to, Chris, I always try to refer to it as clip versus mow, right? Because when I think of mowing, it's like you're mowing your yard, right?
Right, yep.
You might be, 3 inches or below, and it kind of does look like a golf course. But with the pasture, you want to clip it. And if you're using a bush hog, most of the time, you're going to get up in that 5 to 6 inch range if you're clipping it, and that's kind of where you want to be.
Yeah,
So
and
where
that
you
height of grazing is also better for parasite control, because as
Yep,
soon as they start grazing too low to the ground, you're going to increase their parasite loads. So
for
we
sure.
had one more question, but you may be covering it here a little later. Billy Joe wants to know what type of weed control is safe to use in a pasture where horses are currently grazing.
Well, the weed control, it's really going to depend on what specific weed you're dealing with. Um, and I've got one weed that I'm going to talk about in a slide or two here, about the management of that one. So if you can mow your pastures before they go to seed, that would be one good thing to do. The other thing is if you get it, it all kind of wraps back in here. But if you can get a soil test done and keep that grass growing competitively, to outcompete those weeds. The other thing is, you may choose to utilize a herbicide. The thing about that is always read the label, to make sure if there are any grazing restrictions associated with that product. Okay, because some may have a grazing restriction where it says don't graze animals within 7 days of application. Some may say 14 days. Okay, some products may not have a grazing restriction, so that's really dependent on what you're doing. Now, keep in mind that there's no herbicide where you can spray, that's either not going to kill grass or like your legumes. Okay, so you need to make sure that what you're really trying to control, that's the herbicide that you're selecting. In addition to that, you can always just spot spray. But I've got one weed here I'll talk about a little bit too. So hopefully that answered your question.
Tom, we've got one more that might be good to answer right now.
Okay.
How long does it take for a pasture to become mature after seeding? Should I wait for a year to establish good roots?
Typically, that's a long time to wait, and so I would always just like to let it grow up enough where I can mow it a time or two and then go. Okay. The biggest thing, that we run into is, and this happened to one of my neighbors, is with their pasture, is they reseeded it. We're on sandy soil. And as soon as it started to green up, man, out the horses went. And when you're out there observing the horses grazing, you could see them just pulling the plants right out of the ground. Okay, so if you can let us grow up high enough where you can at least mow it once or twice, and let those grasses get established, you'll be better off.
Yeah, and typically it always seems like you don't really get to see the fruits of your labor until that second year
True.
of grazing. So you do really need to take care of it that first year and make
Yep.
sure it's not overgrazed. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Tom.
Well, and the other thing, Chris, and that's a very great point, is you're spending all of this time and resources to get it right. Don't destroy it within the first couple months. So just be patient. Utilize your sacrifice lot. Okay. Moving on, fencing. Okay. Perimeter versus interior. So your perimeter fence is designed to keep your animals in, right? I mean, it's a permanent fence, okay? But your interior fence can be temporary. And personally, I like temporary fencing because it just gives more flexibility with your land-based resources, right? So if you have your permanent fence that's solidly built, right? Now, if we go to our interior fencing, that gives me some flexibility. And as you can see in this picture right here, this was at Ag Expo a couple years ago, and one of Chris and I's colleagues brought his horse down, and we did a rotational grazing demonstration with this horse. So we had 4 little paddocks set up, and this is essentially just the braided rope, electrified rope, and that we hooked up, and we bring the horse in there, let him graze for a little while, and then we move them to the next spot, just to kind of illustrate how that works. But with temporary fencing, if you can adjust your horses to the concept, and that may be dependent on the activity level of your respective herd, it gives you a little bit more flexibility in the end. Okay, and as you can see right here, we just hooked up a solar charger. And one cool thing or an idea, if you're interested, is you can see that these are metal fence posts where we have the solar charger on. I just put black plastic tile drain around that so the horse couldn't hurt itself, and also act like an insulator so I didn't get shocked. I tested it out. I didn't mean to, but I tested it out and it did work. Okay, but really you'd want that black pipe to go all the way up the steel post to keep it covered and hopefully prevent any injury of your horse. Okay, so pasture maintenance needs. Yeah, obviously we need a tractor and a mower. Okay, so if it's just grazed, then we want to clip it to a uniform height, because in a horse pasture, we're going to have those areas where they're known as roughs and lawns, right? Dr. Skelly mentioned the golf course look. That would be the lawns where the horses are continuously grazing all the time. The roughs will be where they're going to defecate, right? So if we can pull them off and clip that to a uniform height and let it start regrowing. And we've already mentioned the clip versus mow. And dragging, if necessary, to break up those manure piles, okay? So if you can do that dragging on a hot, dry day, okay, that's going to work a little better. Try to expose any type of parasites that might be in your manure, okay? Okay, toxic plants. This is just one, okay? There are many, 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 but one of the most familiar, or the one, let's see, I deal with this probably more than any other one, is Historious. This respective plant is toxic if it's eaten fresh, or it can be toxic in hay, dried hay, okay? Toxic principle is not identified, but a classic symptom that you'll see is stocking up in the lower legs if horses are eating this plant, okay? And so then we go down to treatment and prevention. Okay, so this is one of those weeds, depending on what you're looking at, to go back to the previous question. If you have a small infestation of Horiolism that you're finding in your pasture, this would be one that you could hand pull out or dig it out, right, by the crown root. Another example of this would be to mow it before it goes to seed. Okay, if you shallow tilling with this particular weed, goes in the favor of Horiolism, because there are seeds in the seed bank, and so it might actually cause it to grow even more plants to grow. Okay, so it's one of those where a herbicide in this type of case might be another option that you could use to spot spray to try to get rid of some of those infestations of this particular weed. Okay, here's just another picture of it. You can see that it has small little white flowers, and the seeds are oblong with a point at the end, so it's relatively easy to identify. And so what I would do is I would encourage you to be curious about what's in your pasture, right? If I'm walking a pasture and if I see a plant out there that has white flowers on the top, I'm trucking over there to see what it is, okay? It doesn't mean that we need to be an expert in plant identification. However, if we're curious enough to try to figure out what might be in our pasture, it could help us in the long run as far as our horse health is concerned. Okay, so pasture to-do list. Plan your grazing system. Check your fences, right? Soil test, reseed overgrazed or bare areas if you need to. Fertilize, okay? Big one here, let the grass grow, graze it, and then let the grass regrow, okay? If you have any pasture maintenance that needs to be done, such as mowing or clipping, let me say clipping, okay? And then you've got weed control and toxic plants. Figure out what they are, right? So last slide here, take home message. Determine what your goals are, okay? What do you want to do with your respective farm? Really, there's no one that's more of an expert of your respective farm than you and how you're going to manage it, right? So determine what those goals are and how you want to manage your horses. Evaluate the feasibility. See if it actually can be done. Okay, so if you have 5 horses on 3 acres, okay, that might be a little tough to maintain some vegetative cover. Not saying that it couldn't be done, but it's going to take more management to be able to accomplish that. Okay, consider the key components. Those are the ones I just gave you throughout the presentation. Be committed and flexible, right? You know, if it's not time for the horses to go out onto the pasture, even though they're more likely trying to convince you that it is time to go out and they're just so depressed because all of that green grass out there, you know, try to manage your grass to the best that you can. Be flexible with it. And then the last point is avoid overgrazing, right? If you don't want to see weed invasion, avoid the overgrazing. Let that grass be a thick stand of forage and be competitive to outcompete those weeds, okay? And so the last, whoops, guess I don't have it on there, but I just wanted to let you know, the last slide I was gonna talk about was those forage resources on the Michigan State University Forage Connection website. There's lots of really good information on there if you're trying to establish your horse pasture. It talks about no tilling. There's a bulletin on that, so on and so forth. So that's about all I have. And I think I ran it right up to time, Chris, so.
Hey, Tom, we do have a few really good questions in the chat box here. And if anybody else wants to type in their questions, we'll try to get to them either in the chat box or on Facebook Live. But one from Debbie, and this is going to challenge me a little bit. I have what I think is lesped is Lespedeza clover. Tiny yellow flowers. Sorry, I can't pronounce it today.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. And the horses aren't eating it. I'm wondering if my paddocks are too large, which enables them to overgraze their preferred grass.
Potentially, yeah, it could potentially be that. And that's just like when it goes back to, you know, the rotational grazing system, that it kind of forces the horses to graze a little bit more uniformly, okay? In that type of system, that's what we're kind of going for, right? So that would be my answer to that one.
Okay, perfect. Kathy asked, what herbicide do you recommend to kill this weed?
As far as Horiolism?
I think maybe she was talking about the Horiolysium slide, yeah.
Okay. So a good resource for that to find what herbicides might work is the Michigan State University Weed Control Guide. You can find that online as well. And it gives you a table in there. If you scroll down to forages, and there's a table, it's 4A, I believe. and whatever respective weed you're looking to control, it'll tell you in there what the effectiveness is of each herbicide. So if I don't want to guess here, but if I recall correctly, Horiolism 2,4-D is one of the ones that has pretty good control of Horiolism, but there may be a grazing restriction associated with that product. And you may have to use it more than once, spray it more than once. But the MSU weed control guide is an excellent resource for that.
And Kathy has one more question related to Horiolism.
Yep.
How difficult is it to find Horiolisum in hay?
If you actually, it's relatively easy. If you remember the picture that I showed you with the seeds, typically the stem will be there with the seeds. Okay. Just a year or two ago, my neighbor got a load of hay in, and it had some Horiolisum in it. And once I showed her how to identify to look for those seeds, the oblong with the point at the end, right? She was fine with it. She just kind of picked it out as she found it. And that's another thing with that particular weed. You want to avoid hay that has 20 to 30% of Horiolisum in it. We used to say 30%, and now I've seen some reports that have went all the way down to a maximum of 20% in your hay when feeding it to horses. Okay, but in that scenario, she realized or was educated on now how to identify what it was and what it looked like, and she could pick it out, and she just removed it as she saw it.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've experienced working with some owners is we may walk through the barn and say, boy, this certainly looks like there's a Horiolisum issue, just based on the horse's symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't initially find it in the hay. But if you think about how Horiolisum grows in bunches in a hay pasture, what typically will happen is it'll be in a few bales, and then rows of bales that it's not in, and then a few bales it'll be in. So it's kind of hit or miss. So sometimes you just really have to be observant and go through hay every time you feed it if you think you have a problem, and look for it.
Well, that's another point too. Is I've been to several hay auctions, and I'll see some really nice looking grass hay or an alfalfa orchard grass mix, and start looking a little more closely, and I've seen Horiolisum sticking out of it. So just if you can try to educate yourself on how to identify that respective plant.
One more question here, and this is coming from our Facebook page from Elena. Recently drugged the pasture and was curious if I should just go around and hand seed the areas. When is the best time to do this? Now, after a windy day, a cooler day after rain.
Of reseeding an area?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's coming up. I mean, we're starting to get warmer weather now. So you certainly don't want to do it too early to where, like the other night, we woke up and there was frost on the roof, right? So you probably could start that here within the next week or so, to try to get that going. And in addition to that, just make sure that you're keeping the horses off of it. Just want warmer days.
Tom,
Because the soil temperature is going to be still a little cooler.
Yeah.
So
I think that clears up all of our questions that we had. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and especially Tom. I also want you to encourage you guys to, we have a couple of people on our Facebook page that are members of the group E-Extension Horses, and we at Michigan State University Extension work with this group as well. And they have some excellent webinars coming up in the next few weeks, directly looking at how COVID-19 is affecting our horse industry. So if you go to extensionhorses.org, you can find out information on these webinars, and we will also be posting information on these webinars at My Horse University. So I believe the first one is coming up this Wednesday. And I see Dr. Brady and Dr. Green are both on this webinar. So if you could just confirm that and maybe put that information in the chat, that would be great. All right. Thank you very much, guys. And we'll see you next week, next Wednesday, I believe, at noon. Talk about conditioning the horse for spring. Y'all take care.
Thanks, everyone.